Thank you. Good morning. My name is Corey Schmidt. Thank you to the sponsors for having me here today. It's a great honor to be here at the Tommy Douglas Conference Center in Silver Spring. And I was thinking about Tommy Douglas. He's known as possibly one of the greatest Canadians of all time. So it's interesting that we're speaking about SPL. As Health Canada has recently announced that they were going to adopt the SPL standard for their Canadian monograph product. So this is interesting. And being a hockey fan, I also wonder if the Wayne Gretzky conference room was ever in contention, but I don't think so. Anyway. So let me get started. Again, my name is Corey Schmidt, Global Labeling Systems and Compliance Team Lead, Novartis Pharmaceuticals. The standard disclaimer, Novartis disclaimer, and then the agenda. So today I would like to just provide an overview of our department, our global labeling group. Then I would like to go over how SPL is kind of managed at Novartis, how we create the SPL, how we submit the SPL, et cetera. And then we're going to go over some of the systems and tools that we use. And finally, also manage the new SPL requirements. And finally, some of the challenge that we face with the SPL at Novartis. So Novartis is a big place. Within global drug development, there's regulatory affairs, and within regulatory affairs, there's global labeling. Global labeling associates manage the CDS for the products, the creation, update, and dispatch of the CDS. In addition, they manage country labeling or health authority questions from country labeling. Any questions from Germany, for example, about the German label would go filter through our global labeling associates to provide a response. Within this group, there's also a group called compliance, global labeling compliance and artwork, and there's three kind of subgroups within that group: safety label tracking and universal artwork. Safety label tracking is a very serious topic at Novartis. We take it very seriously. It's looked at from the very highest levels. Global labeling systems and compliance group. This is a group that handles the systems, obviously, and then we also manage SPL and the NDC numbers. And then there's the U.S. compliance and artwork group, which handles it's a group of labeling experts which handles the packaging components and the printed artwork. And before I begin, just in case anyone thinks we do SPL for fun, there's some serious regulations behind the scenes. For example, 21 CFR 207, everything here, the mechanism to complete anything here is the SPL file. So this is one of the reasons we take it so seriously. Importation is another reason. If you don't complete the proper listing, you're probably going to have some issues getting your product through the gates at import. So Novartis, it's quite a big place. We have about 120 products in distribution currently. We manage about 300 SPL files a year. This year, probably going to be close to 400, 450 maybe. At Novartis SPL, we include SPL with original NDA BLA submissions and initial prior approval supplements, and of course CBEs. And the pathway here is that this is part of the application. So this would go to the review division, along with the current, the proposed, the Word docs, everything else that's required for submission to the application. Any of the back and forth, any of the reviews that happen for approval, from this step until approval, we do not include SPL. And of course, upon approval, we also are required to include the SPL file. Most of you are probably familiar with the approval letter and the blurb with eListing is required within 14 days. And this is a standalone submission to the Office of Compliance, I think it is. It's not part of the application. It's just the SPL file directly to the Office of Compliance for drug listing. Of course, if it passes validation, then you'll see it on DailyMed. And of course, if there's any changes in establishment information or anything that doesn't affect the content of labeling, then of course we would also need to update the file and submit that. There's many components to SPL. The most familiar, I think, to everybody here would be the content of labeling, the USPI. At Novartis, the regulatory affairs responsible would be the owner of this content. So if there's a question, if Joe, for example, had a question about our Section 12 for one of our products, I would not be getting the call. They would be getting the call. They're the ones that own the content, and they would update it accordingly based on any proposed changes. Product data elements, this can include product characteristics, inactive ingredients, establishment information. This all comes from our Novartis Regulatory Information Management System, our RIM system. And if there's anything that's not included on a RIM system, maybe capsule size, for example, we would go to the regulatory CMC responsible for the product to get this information. Principal display panel, this comes from our US artwork group. So if there's any updates or changes to any of the principal display panels included in drug listing, this would filter to us, and we would update the SPL file. And finally, NDC. So this is something that we take very seriously as well. This is something that we do in the Global Systems and Compliance Group. And as I mentioned NDC, I just want to offer a little insight into how we manage this at Novartis. It's critical number. It's used by downstream by many different organizations, pharmacies, distributors, etc. And the lead time to the request for NDC to when it's actually distributed could be quite long, 6 to 8 months sometimes. And once it's assigned, there's the packaging that has to be created. The product needs to be packaged and ready to be distributed. And you can imagine if it's assigned six months prior and it's incorrect and they're ready to distribute, if anything were to wrong, or if we were unable to, for some reason, list that product, you could imagine that would not be a good day for us at Novartis. So we do everything we can to avoid that. And one of the things we do is the dosage form and the package type. So we start early with the data elements for the dosage form and the package type. So for example, we use the SPL acceptable terms. So if prior to this request form, we had one, and if you were to request a tablet, for example, we would assign the number based on the tablet. When we go to list it, and we'd see, oh, well, there's 15 different choices for tablets here. So we then have to go back to CMC and find out exactly which tablet it is. So we really just, kind of got this information up front. Same thing with package type. We collect this information as early as possible to make sure that we're ready for the listing when it happens. And we're actually improving the system to try to collect more data elements as we move forward. And this is a SPL at Novartis. This is just a view of an SPL. I think probably familiar to most of you. This is a view using the FDA style sheet. So when you open the XML file with Internet Explorer, it pings the style sheet. It comes back and tells it how to render the information. This is interesting because if you look at the very top, this is the Afinitor Everolimus tablet. At the very top, this is not free text. So this is something that is pulled from the data elements. And often we get comments that say, hey, if you look at above recent major changes, which is free text, this is part of the title field, it doesn't match what's at the top. So they always come to me and say, hey, can you have that match our approved content? Well, the fact is we can't. So what's at the very top here is the brand name, the generic name, and the dosage form, the SPL acceptable dosage form. What they write here, it could be anything. It could be free text, it could be whatever's approved. And everything else here is free text except for the headers. So it's good to keep that in mind when you're writing these labels and updating them. If you want to align it with the SPL early, I think that would be a good practice if possible. And this is the same exact file with the daily med view. So the great thing about XML is that it's very web friendly, in addition to being very database friendly. So the same exact file, this is how it would render at the daily med website. Before I get into the conversion process, I just want to point out the FDA SPL implementation guide with validation procedures. This is the holy grail for SPL. Any questions you have, any validation issues, or any, where does this go? How does this work? Basically, this is the guide. This is the where to go. We look at this file quite often, and if anyone's interested in updating an SPL file, I would strongly suggest that they use this as their base. So Novartis, the source document is a Word file. So basically, what is updated and what is provided to us and is an MS Word file. So they would go to the current, we call it, Word file. The author would go and update that based on proposed content, and this is maybe what it would look like when it comes to us. In this example, this is an approved content. So if we accept all the changes here, this would be the new approved content. If we reject all the changes, that's the previously approved content. And our job is to make it look, to update the XML to make it match, basically. So this is the XML view. You can see besides the text, there's other, LOINC codes and that we must manage. It's, part of the job of SPL. And finally, the SPL view. So this is how, when we're finished, we save it. When we open it using the SPL FDA style sheet, this is basically how it would look. So this is the final content, and this is what you would see on Daily Med. And this is just another example. This happens to be a table. This is the same situation. This is, if we accept these changes, this is the new approved text. If we reject them, this would be the previously approved text. And then we go into the XML view of the table. we would make sure that it matches and also aligns the same way as best we can to what is approved. This is the way it looks when we're finished. And as far as product data elements, the big difference here is that this comes from our RIM system. This doesn't come from our Word document. This example here, includes, I think, a dosage form. There's the generic name, the brand name, some strengths, the basis of strength, the NDC number, etc. So on the left, of course, is the XML view, and then on the top is how it's displayed using the FDA style sheet. And here's a similar data elements. This is the inactive ingredients. Thanks to the recent update of the CFR 207, inactive ingredients now required. It's very, very clear. So, we're currently reviewing, making sure all our SPL files include all the proper inactive ingredients. This is kind of how we do it. We use the FDA substance registration system to find the preferred terms and to get the Unicode. If there's any questions, we, of course, go back to our regulatory CMC colleagues for clarification. This is establishment information. So this is something that's required for drug listing as well. It's at the very bottom of your SPL file. It's at the very bottom of the SPL file. On the right side, you can see the drug establishment current registration site. Is that me doing that? I don't know if that's... All right. So on the top right is the drug establishment current registration site. This is the FDA DECR site. We love acronyms in Novartis. And you can see that right here is listed our Stein facility, which is a major manufacturer for us. And the validation that happens here is that if Novartis hadn't listed Stein, this facility, as a manufacturer, we wouldn't be able to include this in our drug listing as a manufacturer for our product. It would be rejected at validation. So this is something we have to check if we have a new packager, make sure that they're registered, of course, before we can add them to our product drug listing. And at the bottom, you can see how it's kind of, Stein's very busy. There's a lot of NDC numbers, and this is for Afinitor, so see all the operations that they do for this product. So I mentioned the source file. This is, again, it's a Word document, and it's a heavily controlled document, heavily quality controlled document. And we have a post-approval procedure that we follow. So not only does it go to SPL, but the same file goes to our Novartis website in PDF format. It goes to our global labeling repository, which is for every product we have to upload it. The United States has to upload their current label, but not only us, but globally, every country would have to do the same thing. And there's also deviation management that's tracked within this repository. There's our document management system, the promotional PI, and of course it's released for artwork and typeset. So ideally, the same file, the same content will be in all these places. And to close the loop, we use something called the FPL LOINC file. If you think about the application, you submit your proposed, you get an approval letter, and then if you were to go back 6 months or a year later and look and say, oh, we submitted it, where's the, how does it kind of close the loop here within the application? Well, we provide this file. So this is just a simple Word document, a cover letter, and a form called final printed labeling. We submit it saying, drug listing was completed on November 2nd, for example, and there's a link in the file that is only active once the drug listing is complete, and it will take you directly to that file. And we hope this alerts the FDA that the eListing requirement is complete, in addition to closing the loop in the application. Some of the systems and tools, we have a global labeling repository. Of course, I mentioned the safety label tracking system, very serious business, and the NDC database and standard document management system. We also have quite a few QC tools. We have a text verification tool, which we use that can compare the text between the Word file and a PDF, or the PDF and XML file, Word file, XML file, so on and so forth. We use this quite a bit. We not only check the XML versus the source, but the source versus what's approved, and what's expected to be approved versus what's approved. So there's a lot of checks that happen here before we release this for public view. There's also a comparison tool we like. This is of a third-party vendor that basically uses all the daily med information and also information available in the UK, and then you're able to go on and compare different labels. So if you like Afinitor, you want to look at version 45 versus version 44, you can go on and search and look, and it'll tell you the differences. You can search by section if you're interested in section 6, and what label lists headache. You can search, various labels, all labels. You can do a whole bunch of different searches. It's a pretty neat tool. In conversion tools, in-house we use XML editors. I like the Altova product. It's really based on your own preference. I'm sure Lonnie and Ed have their own preferences for what they like to use. And the regulatory information management system, of course. This is our source for most of our data elements. And this is the process of being updated or upgraded, in the future. The current system, there's a couple downstream connections, but it's a manual system. Whoever has to enter the data into the system, and then we would have to go in and retrieve the data manually. But the system that we're looking at and hoping to implement in the next few years will actually be a two-way system. So if an SAP database is updated with a new packager, it would automatically populate the RIM system, which would automatically update the SPL, which would automatically be submitted. So it's hopefully the driverless car is in our future in the next few years. And there's quite a few new requirements for SPL. I'm sure you're all aware. Lot distribution data, for example, for BLAs is now required. Novartis has 5 or 6 BLAs, so we have to include this twice a year with the annual reports or semi-annual reports. The REMS SPL, we currently don't have anything working or in the works for this. We did take part in the pilot, and we do have a product that was recently approved that will need to have this REMS SPL. And of course, the no change certification SPL. We haven't finalized how we're going to manage this year. We're definitely doing a thorough review of all our SPL files, and it's possible we'll just submit everything this year again, or if it turns out better, or if feasible, we would go in and create a no change certification SPL. I will say that if we do that, we would probably use the CDER direct tool, because I took a look at that. It's pretty well done. So that would be my choice for that. This is just an example of the lot distribution SPL. So previously, this would be, the top is an Excel file that comes from our manufacturing group. Just gives you the lot numbers and the dosage, the number of lots and what have you. And this previously, before the SPL requirement, this would have been converted to a PDF, put in the submission, and off it went. Anyone needed this data, they'd have to go open the file and then type it into a database. Obviously, the preferred method, the SPL method, takes those steps out of play. And this can be just uploaded into a database, no errors. There's no chance for typos or what have you. And challenges, finally. So the 14-day timeline, believe it or not, is a challenge. Novartis, we value quality over speed, so it seems like we're always up against this 14 days. You throw in a couple weekends, you throw in a couple days off, and then next thing you know, it's day 14, and we have to get this thing out the door. So it's always a challenge here for us. CB submissions, this was a challenge. I'm going to take this off the list. Jeff was nice enough to clear this up for us. We had a question about CBE submissions. We would submit these, implement it. It would be on Daily Med, on our websites, everywhere else, and then we'd get an approval letter 6 months later. The only thing that changed was the revision date. The approval letter says we must submit within 14 days. So it always was a little confusing for us. But Jeff was nice enough to clear up that if there's no additional changes, we don't need to do anything. So that really helps us out, Jeff. Thank you. The SPL data, there's so much data available in Novartis, but I think we're very good at creating the SPL and submitting the SPL, but harnessing all this data, using all this Daily Med data, the indexing files, everything else that's available. So far, we haven't been able to get that going. Structured authoring, of course, is a major challenge for us. We haven't been able to implement an authoring tool. We did try early on, 2006 we tried, but the tool was a little primitive maybe, and a little too new for everybody. But we are trying again with our global group, and I think we will have better luck this time. And of course, integrations. So if anytime you bring new products in, existing products, it's always a challenge. So hopefully this is it for me. I provided a brief overview of our group, how we kind of manage SPL at Novartis, some of the systems and tools we use, and managing new SPL requirements, and of course the challenges that we face. That's all. Thank you.
Morning, my name is Lonnie Smith. I'm a policy analyst with the Office of Health Informatics and the Office of the Chief Scientist in the Commissioner's Office. The standard disclaimer, which I'm sure you'll hear quite often from the other FDA employees that are presenting. Even though we have 66 different types of SPL files, they're currently submitted to about 4 different centers at the FDA. I'm just going to give an overview from the continental labeling perspective for CDER and talk about how we process the SPL files once they're received by FDA, and also how the public utilizes the SPL file in advance of Ed's presentation. He'll give you more detail about that. So over 12 years ago, on October 31st, on Halloween 2005, so we recently had our 12th year anniversary, we received our first SPL file that was submitted in compliance with the electronic labeling rule. CDER posted a document memo stating that SPL would be the format that we would use to submit electronic content labeling in compliance with electronic labeling rule. Initially, there was only one SPL file on DailyMed, and that SPL file remained on DailyMed for 6 months as the only SPL file on DailyMed, as companies were getting accustomed to creating these new types of SPL files. Fortunately, in the middle of 2006, we started seeing more SPL files come in. But one of the purposes of providing this data in electronic format and posting on DailyMed is that when you look at the paper content labeling, sometimes the labeling was ripped. So when the pharmacies went to the shelf, they might have ripped the labeling by accident, resulting in some of the critical data being missing. So one of the benefits of posting the SPL file on DailyMed, that if that was the case, a pharmacist could go to DailyMed and look at the most current version of the content labeling. Also, the labeling on the shelf could be outdated because the labeling is submitted with the package, and sometimes the labeling was also often in the container. Some of the benefits, at least from the FDA's perspective, is that we wanted to provide better access to the public, which includes the consumers, patients, healthcare information providers with the content labeling. In 2009, we started using the gateway and other tools, which would allow companies to have a 24-hour submission window. So they didn't have to just submit with their ECTD submission to have the data post publicly. They could submit it to the gateway or another type of submission tool that CDER has. We also wanted to reduce the amount of time. Initially, we were receiving the SPL file with the application, and then the SPL file was transferred from the application to another system, and that just wasn't very feasible. So we streamlined the process in 2009 so that as soon as the SPL file was received, it was posted to the system, which would be used to process the data. Another issue we noticed from 2005 to 2009 was that there was no automatic notification because the SPL file was included with the ECTD submission, or at that time, eNDA or eBLA as well, or EANDA. And so in 2009, we started providing a response indicating exactly which errors were included in the submission to the company, and if they were using the gateway, the response would be sent within 15 minutes of their submission, of the receipt of their submission by the FDA gateway system. And of course, one of the biggest benefits is that we can post the data a lot more quickly, because if the data does pass the technical validation, then it can be published on DailyMed and other websites within 1 business day. Just to let you know, if the government is closed, DailyMed does not get updated on that date. So there are 3 entities that we usually associate with using SPL. It's the drug companies, of course, because they're creating SPL files. And then those files can be sent to FDA and can be reviewed by the FDA reviewer, including some of the reviewers that Corey was speaking about with regards to drug listing, as well as the reviewers in the review divisions in CBER and CDER. Then, of course, the DailyMed user or any other type of system user that has SPL files in it. So there's only one SPL file, and so actually, if you have all 3 of these entities looking at the same file, they'd be looking at the same data on various computers, but the information, the content, regardless of how it was displayed, would be the same as that content. So if you look at a PDF file, we consider that as unstructured text, because you cannot just search on a section such as the description section in a PDF file. You can search on a word description, but you can't search on just that particular section. So with SPL, we separate the sections and we code all of the different sections using LOINC codes, which Ed will be presenting on later. And so if we want to search on every single SPL file that was coded with the LOINC code for the description section, we could retrieve all of those sections, just those sections from every single SPL file in our system, and there's almost 100,000 SPL files. And the same is applicable to the other sections which are listed on this slide, as well as other sections which are not included. We have what we call the extensible markup language. Basically, it's relatively human legible, but the most important part is that it's machine readable. You can create an SPL file, which is in XML format, with any type of software. In fact, you don't even need software. You can use Notepad, WordPad. You can also use validation tools. We make those publicly available, and we use the same validation for the most part in our system as the publicly available validation tool. If you prefer not to hand code the SPL file, you can use the FDA provided, or there are plenty of commercially available software tools. Corey was talking about the style sheet. The FDA provides a style sheet, and he showed you that view. Daily Med takes the same data and presents it in a different view. And also, companies such as drugs.com, they will transform the data. And so everyone's looking at the exact same content. It's just displayed differently based on the style sheet that's used for the system. So this is just a brief view of both the code and the style sheet view. I do want to highlight, since Ed will be talking about that later, but there's the LOINC code. The LOINC code basically describes the content in the section. And if there's a LOINC code that's available, that LOINC code should be used for that particular section. There's also what's known as the effective time, and that time is should be representative of when that content was updated. So even though the entire SPL file has an effective time, each content labeling section and subsection also has an effective time. And this is beneficial for anyone who's looking at the time frames for when a particular section of the SPL file was updated. I should also point out that there's also a section ID, and in that section ID, the FDA system takes that section ID and compares it every single time an SPL file is submitted. So if you make one change to that section, then the FDA system will detect a change, and it will also make sure that the section ID is different. And basically that helps the healthcare information system provider, such as Ed's company, determine when a section is changed from a programmatic perspective. So now I'm going to talk about processing of the SPL files. So we've had to make several updates to the SPL data standard, at least the FDA's implementation, with regards to content labeling updates. In 2005, of course, that's when we started. Less than a year later, we had to update it for physician's labeling rule. And so we just added the highlights tag so that that information could be presented at the top of the SPL file for PLR documents. As Corey was talking about, CFR 207, even though CFR, the final rule was published last August, Congress gave FDA the ability to collect the drug establishment registration and listing information for certain biological products as well as human drugs in 2007, and we implemented the electronic collection of that data in 2009. One very important topic is life cycle management. We spend a lot of our time providing set IDs to companies because sometimes they lose their set ID. And like every day we get an email or a telephone call from a company because they lost their set ID. And then we have to go and find the set ID and send it to them after verifying that they have the right to have that information in the first place. So the set ID is basically one of the most important XML elements in the file, because when we send a version of the SPL file to Daily Med, their system reads the set ID and makes the determination regarding whether or not which SPL file should be updated on the Daily Med system. The document ID just basically identifies a version of the SPL file from a system perspective. I already talked about the section IDs, and the version number just provides human readability with regards to which version is being submitted. So there's two ways that SPL files can be submitted to CDER and CBER. If you submit the SPL file to the CBER or CDER electronic document room, if it's a prior approval, it remains in the electronic document room and of course gets disseminated to the appropriate staff for review, but it does not get published. If you submit a CBE 0 or CBE 30, or what we call a final SPL, which is post-approval SPL file, post-approval to any labeling changes that were approved for the original application or supplemental labeling revision, as well as the annual report. If you submit it to electronic document room, it stays in electronic document room. Every so often, at least a couple times a month, we get a call from a company asking why their SPL files haven't been published on DailyMed or any other public web repositories for SPL. And it's usually because they have either submitted the SPL file to the electronic document room where it remained, or they put in a future marketing start date. Companies are permitted to determine when their SPL file should be made publicly available by entering a marketing start date. In the future, if they prefer to not have it be publicly released right away, or if it's okay if it gets released immediately, they can put in today's date or a past date, and they'll get published the next business day. However, if you have a CBE or a final SPL or annual report that should be published immediately, you send it through the Gateway or the CDER Direct, or pretty much any system that will allow the SPL file to be provided to the FDA's internal system called eList, and the SPL file will be made publicly available. In some cases, for example, for CBER, they prefer that the SPL file be submitted both to the application and to the eList system. If the SPL file for CBE or final SPL or annual report is submitted to the public repository, you can provide a link in your, again, it might be correspondence, or depending on what type of submission you're sending, if it's might be correspondence for final SPL or annual report or CBE supplement. You provide that link will allow the project manager to click on that link and find the SPL file that's in the public repository. The instructions for creating the link is in the guidance document that we have published as draft guidance for structured product labeling, content labeling, and we've had this guidance published since 2009. Basically, it just provides the technical instructions for creating the link. Corey mentioned validation. We take validation very seriously at FDA. We try to publish all of our validation procedures in the implementation guide and validation procedures document to which Corey was making reference. It is one of our most important documents when it comes to the technical conformance specifications. It's 299 pages right now. So we have a lot of different validation procedures, not, of course, related only to content labeling, but for all the types of SPL files that we have. And in that validation procedures document, even though it just looks like text, there's what's called a schematron in the background that actually does the validation. So some of the validation that pertains to content labeling is if someone provides an image, we check the size. And this is basically just to ensure that we don't get images of 5 megabytes and that after a while the database is full just based on huge images. Because I think for one SPL submission, because it had instructions for use for the medical device, there was over 105 images. So if you think about that, it does start to matter regarding the size. So we limit the size to 1 megabyte per image. We also check for alternative text. Now, alternative text is very important for Section 508 because there's a requirement that if any federal government agency publishes a document on the web, that it must be accessible to those who are, for example, visually impaired. So we make sure that there's alternative text. And basically what that alternative text is, it just basically describes what the image is. For example, if it's an image of the carton container label, that could be the alternative text. And this is important because those who are visually impaired, they use a screen reader, and the screen reader will describe what that image is. So you should be very careful when you're entering that information because basically that's what the screen reader is going to provide to the visually impaired person. We also make sure that if you include 10 images in your submission, that there's 10 references in the SPL file. We validate the sections. We make sure that if you include a LOINC code, that it is the correct LOINC code and is one that's applicable to the content of labeling. For certain documents such as PLR, we will check to make sure that you include the boilerplate language that goes in the highlights limitation statement as well as the adverse reaction section. If that's applicable, of course, we still have some non-PLR SPL files. If there's a medication guide, we check for that. We also check for content updates because the last image on this slide is what we call the FDA Reference Information Model database and has all the existing files. So when a new file comes in, our system will check to make sure that one, if there was a previous version, that you're using the same set ID. If you made any changes to that section, we check the drug listing information as well as the content of labeling sections to ensure that you change the section ID if appropriate. There's another type of validation method, and Ed's going to talk about some of the type of validation methods they do. I call it the manual human review. We have a lot of different entities which use SPL. The National Council for Prescription Drug Programs is one of them. National Library of Medicine, they use it. I'm going to briefly describe how they use it later. And CMS also do the same. We also have the FDA staff, such as the FAERS group. So if any of these groups find any issues with the SPL file that was submitted, they will alert the SPL team, and we will work with the appropriate entities to make sure that the SPL is corrected. The preference, of course, is that there's no errors in the file period when you send it. Sometimes there's a need to combine SPL files. For example, this happens a lot with the generic drugs. So if a generic drug label has, for example, just a 25 milligram and a 50 milligram, and the OGD requests that they submit the application separately for whatever reason they do. Sometimes it's because they want to make sure that if one strength isn't approved, that the other one will be approved. But if there's any need to ever combine the SPL files, we have a mechanism for that. We use what's known as a related document element without getting into too many details. Basically, you're just describing which one of the SPL files is to be replaced. For now, because Daily Med system does not automatically recognize the related document element as an indication that one of the SPL files should be replaced, you will have to alert the SPL team to have one of the SPL files removed. Ed's going to touch on this, but I wanted to include it in my presentation to show you that the FDA is also serious about this. We noticed that there were some issues with the medication guide section, and one of the first things we did was we made sure that the medication guide was a separate section, and one of the benefits of that is that the National Library of Medicine system can easily recognize that section, and they can put the link to just the medication guide on their website. And Ed will provide some details about that. We noticed, and we were receiving a lot of reports from companies such as Ed's company. He'll give you a lot more detail about that. And so we have been working for the last year or so to improve the medication guide validation. And in August of 2017, we updated the validation list to hopefully catch as many of the medication errors as possible. So we have something called indexing SPL file. In June 2008, the FDA published a draft guidance related to the indexing files. Initially, the plan was for the companies to index their files, include information such as the pharmacologic class and indications, but after some considerable discussion and thought at the FDA decided that the FDA would publish the indexing SPL files. And we wanted to make sure that we did not make any changes to the company's files that were submitted because we want the companies to be responsible for all the content in the SPL files that are made publicly available. So we created a concept called indexing. And what we'll do is we'll enter information such as the mechanism of action for the pharmacologic class, billing units, which is the information such as how the products are billed from companies that belong to the National Council for Prescription Drug Programs, NCPDP. We have a agreement with NCPDP to complete the billing unit indexing files. We work with our chemists in my office and other offices on indexing the substance information. We also have the product concept indexing file, which is to prepare for feature indexing such as indication. And we also have the biosimilar indexing file. And we're working with the medication error staff and other staff in CDER to make the non-proprietary name that FDA prefers available in this type of indexing file. We do not make changes to the company's files. We add some type of indicator, whether it's a set ID of the file that we're indexing, depending on the type, or for example, for the pharmacologic class, we include the unique ingredient identifier for the active moiety, and that's how the pharmacologic class information is linked to the company's file without making any changes. And of course, there's a lot of other details that I won't get into today, but we do have a guidance document published. So, like I said in the beginning, one of the main goals was to make this information available to the public. And so this is basically just a schematic of how the FDA sends data to National Library of Medicine. We send a product SPL file through one FTP site, and we send the indexing files to the other. And as of probably later this year, we're going to create another FTP site so that the REMS data can be submitted based on a request from National Library of Medicine. Once we submit the information, it goes to National Library of Medicine. They usually, based on the fact that we provide the set ID and the file, they can usually update SPL files on DailyMed within 1 business day. And a very important part is that we want to make sure that the healthcare information providers can access this data. So there's a download feature, and on a nightly basis, a lot of healthcare information providers in any system which wants the SPL data can automatically extract that data from the DailyMed website. If you correct one file, you will automatically correct the data on these 3 websites. Of course, there are other websites, but these are just the ones I picked for this particular presentation. On DailyMed, labelstaff.gov, and a new site that we have called OpenFDA, new as of 2014, that is. If you would like to receive an automatic notification that your SPL file has been updated, you can sign up for the DailyMed RSS feed, and I think you can get updates based on 7 days. I haven't looked at it in a while, but they do have an RSS feed, and so that's how different entities get updated. For example, the repackers and relabelers that repack and relabel drugs, they can get this feed, and they'll know when the original manufacturers updated their SPL file, and so the repacker and relabeler can then update theirs as well, without having to open up every single SPL file in DailyMed. So this is one of my favorite slides because it shows like how SPL is disseminated, and also give you a little background on each one of the different federal government agencies that use the SPL data. The manufacturer distributor submits the data to FDA, and what I refer to as new, because a lot of people aren't aware of it, OpenFDA, it's only been around for 3 years, but when we publish the SPL data in this source, also, other information is also posted there, such as the adverse event. And so entities can build mobile applications to access OpenFDA. And one example of that is that one company, they took the adverse event data and the one section of the content of labeling based on the LOINCs, and they display that information. So if someone searched for a particular drug using their mobile device, for that particular app, the adverse event data will show, and then also just maybe just the adverse event section of the labeling will show. And it does that for every single drug in their system. We have the labels.fda.gov, which is this FDA's version of DailyMed, I guess you could call it. And basically, we just wanted a resource where the labeling was being displayed using the FDA preferred style sheet. Since 2012, we've been providing data to CMS for Medicare Part D reimbursement. So if any reimbursement needs to occur and the NDC is not included in the SPL file, that reimbursement does not occur. And we've been submitting SPL file to DailyMed through the National Library of Medicine since the very beginning. One of the reasons for that is because in 2004, the National Committee for Vital Health Statistics gave their opinion to the then Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, and a recommendation was that the FDA provide SPL data to the National Library of Medicine in support of their electronic prescribing initiative. So as you can see, there are a lot of different entities that can use the SPL data. We hear from them often. A lot of people think that, oh, if my drug product isn't on the market, I don't need to submit an SPL file. One of the entities that use the SPL data are the educational institutions, and so to them, it's not important that the drug is not on the market. They would like to have the content labeling information for their research purposes. And I hope I didn't go over my time. I might have. But this is my last slide. And basically it just talks about, you know, what Ed is about to give you more detail on. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ed Milliken, and today I look forward to talking to you about a topic that is near and dear to my heart for about the past 7 years. And that has to do with SPL medication guides and mining the extraction, SPL data challenges with medication guide extraction and data mining. This is my disclaimer slide. And I'll cover the 5 objectives, which are we're going to learn about medication guides that are sourced from the FDA and structured product labeling, discuss issues regarding incorrect SPL LOINC codification or missing medication guide content, review issues with bulleted lists and formatting of content in medication guides, review the feedback that we provide to the FDA, and then discuss the benefits of SPL and the importance of careful coding and content review. So a little bit about my background. I'm a pharmacist by training, and I did a residency in drug information informatics. So I was hired back in the early 2000s to convert the patient medication information and the Handbook on Injectable Drugs by ASHP from text files into XML, which is extensible markup language. And what that allows for is one set of source files that can then be repurposed into electronic or in print, because we have both. In 2005, as Lonnie was stating, the first SPL became available on Daily Med, and that was my first foray into structured product labeling. So I had experience then interpreting the SPL elements and importing them into databases that we use internally now for helping us to monitor and update our content and to look at information on product information, SPL, NDC codes to help us update ours. So in 2010, we had a client come to us who was interested in medication guides, and basically we were familiar with SPL at Daily Med, and it was suitable for the extraction that they needed. So they needed not only PDF medication guides, but also XML. But first I want to start with a question. Raise your hand, or online, please bear with me. Raise your hand if you've ever bought a piece of furniture and you've tried to put it together, and inevitably you're missing a bolt, a screw, or a washer. That's quite a few people. You've had mislabeled pieces, and sometimes you've had missing pieces. And so you know how frustrating that can be. And so I'm going to relate that today to sometimes what we found in structured product labeling. This is not majority of the time. It just happens. And when you find it, we want to correct it. And so that's what we're going to talk about. We know that the structured product labeling contains basically the instruction manual for prescribing and dispensing and administering medication. So it's clinically important information for both a healthcare provider and a patient. It's content that needs to be updated and correct for public consumption. And also it's important for it to be current and correctly codified. So going back to our client, we knew that the FDA medication guides were available in PDF format from the FDA. The issue is here, they needed both PDF and an XML format. They also needed to fit this into pharmacy and clinician workflow, so therefore they needed the NDC code, which is specific to the product level. So when a product is dispensed, they can also dispense the medication guide. So we were familiar with Daily Med, hosted by the National Library of Medicine. We had been downloading this content and reviewing and mapping the content. We also knew that it was the official repository for the structured product labeling and package insert information. It allowed for PDF and XML generation. It allowed for putting this information into clinician workflow and also healthcare pharmacy systems. And we could extract the NDC code and map that to the medication guide. So basically we use some basic programming languages and technology to mine structured product labeling. We would incorporate this extracted content into database tables. Then we would create our own internal database tables to help us monitor for medication guides. And then we would look inside the SPL for a specific coding, so a LOINC code that I'll get into in a moment, and why they're very important that they're coded carefully. And then we were able to generate medication guides in both the PDF and XML format that we mapped to the NDC code. So since 2010, when we initially started, we had over 900 medication guides that were mapped to greater than 5,300 NDC codes. And at the beginning of October, we are up to over 6,800 documents mapped to over 28,000 NDC codes. And what I'm going to focus on today is we're trying to get closer to 100% from what's available within structured product labeling. And we're going to talk about missing or miscoded or content that needs to be included within structured product labeling. And the majority of these issues we find with repackagers and relabelers. So, but it's good for everyone just to take a look at how you're coding things, and we're going to talk about that now. So some of the issues regarding incorrect SPL, LOINC codification, or missing medication guides. But first, I want to cover what is a LOINC code and why they're important. So LOINC code actually represents logical observation identifiers, names, and codes. This is maintained by the Registry Institution. The universal code to identify medical terminology. It's actually used as a section heading LOINC code within structured product labeling that can provide automation in matching section title with content. These are examples of some LOINC codes that are used in non-PLR format. So warnings, precautions, general precautions, information for patients, laboratories test section, drug and or laboratory test interactions, and how supplied section. And now the next slide I'm going to show you are, there are two specific codes, the adverse reactions code and the use in specific populations code for major sections in the PLR format. But as you get within the subsections of these major sections, there could be more LOINC codes that would be made available, and we'll talk about that. And there may be an opportunity, if there's willingness on industry and FDA, to include things like clinical trials experience subsection, immunogenicity subsection, post-marketing experience under the adverse reactions, and then under use in specific populations, renal impairment, hepatic impairment section, and then also another major section, house supplied storage and handling section, because right now there's only a house supplied section LOINC code. Also, patient counseling information LOINC code is needed. So think for a second, how are you currently coding your patient counseling information section? Now, these are a few options with patient labeling. Instructions for use, the SPL med guide section, SPL patient package insert, and then the patient medication information section. There's not a specific LOINC code right now for this in the PLR format. And then there's the all-encompassing, my favorite, labeling part not classified. It's not really my favorite part. We want more specific information. So today, though, what I want to focus on is the LOINC code for structured product labeling medication guide. So if you have a medication guide, it's really important because downstream users are coding off of these these LOINC codes. And the SPL medication guide is really what needs to be used, 4223-1. So we're going to focus on the 42231-1, the SPL medication guide section, and I want to go over how we found this medication guide section coded. It's been coded as all 6 different versions of this, okay? And it's a little confusing, and so some of this we can work with. The important thing is that the title element contains the term medication guide, so we can try and code off of that. Ideally, though, it should be the medication guide code 42231-1. And then towards the end, we'll cover some other LOINC codes that maybe we need more specific LOINC codes based on PLR versus the non-PLR format. My first example is a medication guide coded as 42231-1. And the reason we know that there's a medication guide is because the style sheet at the National Library of Medicine has a link to the medication guide here. Now this passes validation. The FDA's worked hard at trying to find what labels should have a medication guide. But unfortunately, there's a way around this. Don't put any content in the medication guide section. So what we have is it says the medication guide has been approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, but there's literally no content. And you can go and click on the link, but this is what you get. This is what it looks like on Daily Med. So there's Med Guide section. And we're able to detect this based on some algorithms internally. We monitor bite-size codes. So we really look at the medication guide content closely. Again, it's missing the LOINC code and the content. This is what it looks like behind the scenes. There's the med guide code. There's the paragraph. That's it. So the next section, and it was recently updated, September 15, 2017. So it does pass validation. The next code is kind of at the other extreme. There's no the medication guide section with a LOINC code, and there's no content. So this is for Residronate. There's no hyperlink here because if there was a code for LOINC code for medication guide, you see the hyperlink here, and it doesn't contain that code, and there's no content. This is what it looks like on Daily Med. Typically, the medication guide would appear after the patient counseling information, along with the patient package insert information. This is what it looks like. This is actually just to show you that the medication guide is required by the FDA, and it does appear in the list for Residronate. So this is one of our sources for knowing when to have a medication guide. There are several ways that we look for medication guides and source them, but this is our main source. We also have medication guide included, but it's coded as an unclassified section. Again, there's no medication guide code because there's no link, because it's coded as an unclassified information. If you go and look at this on Daily Med, you'll see that it specifically says it's an unclassified section, and there's a medication guide. The coding behind this looks like this. There's the 4229-5 for unclassified information. And the medication guide looks like it might be in a title, but it's not. The medication guide has been forced into an element that is bolded. And what's missing is this right here, where you see title. That element needs to be filled with the term medication guide for it really to be properly codified. The next one, we found medication guides floating in patient medication information sections. There's no code here for medication guide. There's no hyperlink because it's coded as patient medication information. And underneath that, you'll find the medication guide. So this isn't awful because at least it's in a section that we can try and search for. Had this been in the title, had medication guide been in the title element, we could have extracted it. But here, it's buried in a content element, and that's so non-specific, it's not readily retrievable or extractable. This is what the coding looks like, patient medication information section. There, again, it's been bolded into a content element. It's not in the title element. We have seen medication guides coded as information for patients. Again, there's no LOINC code, no link to a medication guide because it's coded as 34076. If you look here, this is actually difficult to see. It says, please see the medication guide, but it's down here below the patient counseling information. And this is what it looks like. Now, this addresses one of my questions earlier. It says it's coded as 34076-0, which is patient counseling, which is information for patients, but they've titled it patient counseling information simply because there's really not a specific LOINC code available right now for this section. And their medication guide is, those dotted lines means there's more coding, and down below is medication guide content. And finally, house supply. We've seen medication guides slip into the house supplied section. Down there's the medication guide. This is the house supplied section code. And this is what the medication guide is within a paragraph element. It's not even bolded, so it's not quite obvious that it's there. And this is just an example of an NSAID medication guide in the house applied section. And we know that it says to dispense a medication guide, but it's not readily retrievable because it's down within the content of the section. So the next objective, just want to cover a few bolded lists and formatting issues. And people may think this is minor. It's actually really important, and you'll see why as I show you some examples that are live. The first thing is, whenever you have content, it's important to put all the content into one element instead of splitting it up. Right here, we have a title that's been, it's crossing many content elements, and it just makes it more difficult to try and extract this information. Really, you need to put all the content into one element, so one title element. Forced bolded lists, what that is when people take a paragraph and they put content in it, and then they put a high-bit character that makes it look like there is a bullet there, but it's not an official list. And why is that important? Use the list element, and based on a style sheet, you can either number the list or you can use bullets based on what you've put in your attribute there as the list type. But the reason it's important is because this is what it can look like. And if you're a patient trying to read this, it's just confusing. And this is actually good compared to some of the things we've seen. So it's just confusing to read. And really, we want to have clear content especially for patients to be able to read and comprehend. The other issue that we find, and the reason this is important, there's a lot of blank space that occurs within some medication guides. Now, you may think that's harmless, but when you are a pharmacist trying to print this off, and it's a 2 to 3 page medication guide, it turns into 11 pages. And if you're a patient trying to read it, it's even more confusing because you're flipping through the pages trying to find the content. So be cognizant of the BR elements that appear. This is what it looks like. They're just a bunch of empty elements. BR just represents a breaking space or backspace return. This is another example of a medication guide with a lot of extra space. So these technical components, though they may be boring to most people, they're really important when people are trying to use the structured product labeling downstream. So again, here's a code for an unclassified section, and then here's the medication guide. And that's the culprit, is these are empty BR elements. This one is really interesting. So you got text overlay display issues. And you got confusing bullets because this is another forced list, and these are horizontal bullets. They should be vertical in order for a patient to really be able to understand this. And sometimes you get elements where they bolded sections for content, and somehow the content of the bolding section will appear flipped. So you'll get text afterwards that really should be before this. But this right here is just an example of a bold, and then it's just a confusing bulleted list. And if you look behind the scenes, this is coded as a list, but the issue is these caption elements with high bit characters that make it difficult for the patient to try and understand this content. Ultimately, my point is, whenever possible, use the most specific LOINC code available, especially for medication guides. Please don't use the unclassified code. That's just, it helps us in trying to get this information to the patient. So we've talked about how medication guides have been coded. Now I want to focus on a couple of other LOINC codes, drug interaction LOINC codes, and geriatric use section. And I point these out because these examples are a non-PLR and a PLR format. So in the precaution sections, in the non-PLR format, you would have drug interactions. And as you can see, here's the drug interactions. But the issue is there's not a specific code really for a non-PLR drug interaction section. So it's been classified as an unclassified section. But really, for downstream users, it would be really helpful if we had a code for this in the non-PLR format so we could identify this information. But in the same SPL, there is a specific enough code to where they can code for a geriatric use in the non-PLR format. And there's the code. And then for a PLR format for drug interactions, again, it's the highest level section. So there is a code here for the drug interactions in the PLR format. And there it is, 34073-7. So this is very useful for downstream users, is when this information can be specifically coded with the LOINC code. And now I just want to show you a couple examples, some odd things that happen within structured product labeling, things that slip through. This is a kit with incomplete SPL. So basically there's a patient package insert, there's storage and handling, warnings, and then questions, which I'm not familiar with that section. But it exists, and this is for diclofenac sodium and capsaicin as a kit. And if you go and you look on the box, you've got the two separate products combined here. But if you look up the ANDA that corresponds to this SPL of drugs at FDA, it actually is specifically for diclofenac sodium, 1.5% topical. And there's no mention of capsaicin. So we find things like that with these kind of forced kits that are confusing in SPL, and it kind of decreases your confidence about what exactly is this. And the next slide, it's not advancing right now. There we go. Are sometimes virtually empty SPLs. This is for fentanyl citrate. And it's classified as an unapproved drug, but it's just odd that there's only a label for this and then the ingredient information is listed. So I have a question, and this is just a poll for everyone online and everyone here to think about. Which additional LOINC code names and codes for PLR format subsections should be added? What would be useful? And so these are a few suggestions that we have. So 1, hepatic impairment subsection. 2, a renal impairment subsection. 3, a post-marketing experience subsection. 4, immunogenicity subsection. 5, clinical trials experience in subsection. 6, all, or 7, none of these above. So those of you online, if you could just quickly take the poll, it would give us some great feedback. Okay, a few answers. Looks like all of these could be useful. I know as a downstream user, we would be appreciative of it.
And for the folks online, don't check all the boxes. You're not allowed to do that. Pick out your top 3 that you'd like to see added. This poll allows you to pick more than one if you have some.
Great. So this will be useful information. We appreciate everyone participating there. Oh, it looks like, we had all of these still ahead, but it looks like post-marketing experience, renal and hepatic impairment, they're all very similar. It looks like everyone would be interested in most of those appearing, top 3. Okay, and for the next poll question, we have some LOINC codes displayed down there for sections and subsections that are common to PLR and to non-PLR format. So the question here is, would it be helpful to distinguish between PLR and non-PLR sections and subsections? So for example, a PLR drug interaction LOINC code, and then have a separate non-PLR drug interaction subsection in the precautions. So if we could vote on this, just a simple yes or no, would it be helpful to have different LOINC codes for subsections within PLR or non-PLR format? And it looks like yes is winning. So it seems like it would be helpful for labelers, and I can assure you downstream users would really benefit from having that specificity. Okay, and finally, I want to talk about our feedback that we provided to FDA, and this is a weekly ongoing process between our clients. So we have weekly feedback from them, and we've been providing this since 2010 to the FDA. And we've been doing it about on a monthly basis for the past 6 years. We found that over 600 medication guides have been updated or corrected, so that manufacturers have updated the content. We're able to extract the medication guide. And over the past year, we've actually upped our reporting to bi-monthly. So twice a month, we report to the FDA the issues we find and then what our client finds. And progress has been made, but we still got a little bit further to go with data integrity and incorrect coding. And most often, again, it's the repackagers and relabelers, but I would encourage everyone just to take a look at what's going on with LOINC codes in structured product labeling for each product. And basically what happens is we find an issue, we report it to the FDA. The FDA would then in turn contact the manufacturer. The manufacturer would correct the SPL. The SPL would go back up on Daily Med. We would re-download on a weekly basis. And then once we're able to extract the medication guide, we pass that on to our client and ultimately the patient. And so we have some good news. There is something that is occurring called delisting of outdated SPLs. There's a new 21 CFR 207 that was published in August 2016 and implemented November 2016. So basically, beginning in 2017, there's now an annual requirement to update, listing, or certify that no changes have occurred to the SPL. And this could certainly help with valid SPL. So getting some of the outdated labels that aren't being looked at that may be causing problems to get those out of there. So we're excited about this. And finally, we just want to discuss the benefits of SPL and the importance of careful coding and content review. Basically, correctly codified SPLs increases SPL reliability. If you increase reliability of SPL, you'll increase the confidence of the people that are trying to use it. It will drive more users to adopt the SPL and learn about it, and it will provide more feedback, so crowd review, so more people looking at this, and then the usage of SPL with regard to clinical content. It also allows for richer data mining and dissemination of clinical information. So it's super useful to downstream users and especially to try and help get information to patients. Something on the horizon, the risk evaluation mitigation strategies. The first one has been posted, the SPL format, and this will help be a driving force of the use of SPL. And as a clinician, as a pharmacist or a physician or nurse, ultimately, the goal would be to find all clinically important content to safely prescribe, dispense, and administer medication in one easily discoverable location. Now, it may be all in SPL or it may be links, but it's important to have quick access because right now there are many disparate systems, and trying to find out if there was a MedWatch recall or an alert or a drug shortage information, it's all over in many different areas. We know that the SPL warning letters, there is an indexing file now for that, but in the future there may be more SPL files available for indexing the content of labeling, which would be even better because the more specific granularity you have with SPL, the greater the ability to mine the data and link and map. Very exciting. So finally, in summary, missing or incorrect coding is mainly an issue with the repackagers and relabelers. Codification of SPL is just as important as the content of labeling. And in some instances, its codification is more useful than the PDF itself of labeling for data mining purposes. So please review all SPL content as carefully as the PDFs and documents that are available at the Drugs at FDA or what may be on your corporate website. And ensure that all sections are coded specifically as allowed by the SPL guidance documents. Ensure a clinician is reviewing the SPL, and also it would be a good idea to have a technical person to look at the SPL. So someone with some computer background who would pick up on multiple elements being used to describe what's in a title or your lists and bulleted information. It may appear fine sometimes, but ultimately it's really good to have clean XML or SPL content. And review your SPLs at Daily Med, of course. Take a look at what they look like online, and then update, no less than what's available at Drugs at FDA or on your corporate website. The goal here is to have a complete structured product label that is useful, well labeled, nothing missing, just like a well put together bookshelf that has been labeled and put together because you have all the right information. So having said that, thank you for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ed. We'll go ahead and take questions. One of the big questions we've got that I'll field first is, where are Lonnie's slides? Came up a lot online, came up a lot in there. I apologize, that's my fault. I didn't get those into that big zip file as early as I did the others. If you go back to a great little website I'll tell you about called SBIAevents.com and download that zip file again, it now does have the PDF for Lonnie's talk in there as well. As usual, please line up at the microphones and we'll take the questions as they come in. Let me make sure that one got turned on. Not yet. All yours, please go ahead.
Hello, there it is. Great presentations. I guess a question for Lonnie. I enjoyed hearing the background and so on around XML and how we've come to where we are now, and then hearing Edward's presentation about from the user's perspective, and that's the whole point of getting the XML out there, is for interoperability and for downstream use and so on. Can you tell us, Lonnie, what forum you may have to get feedback from electronic health record users or other groups as to how we are doing and how useful it is or what problems are coming up?
We usually have all entities contact the FDA through the SPL email account if the question is specific to SPL. So we get questions through that account a lot.
Next at the microphone, please go ahead.
So Lonnie, you talked about how important it was for us not to lose the set ID. And this may be a naive question, but what is a set ID? I'll make sure not to lose it if I know what it is.
The set ID is basically the main identifier for a group of documents. So most of the time you will never see it, and you will never pay attention to it unless you get an error because you changed the set ID. So it's embedded within the XML code.
Okay.
So.
All right. Thank you.
You can just use your microphone that's still on. Oh, okay, go ahead.
One thing I'll add about the set ID, it's super important. Consider that set ID is like the primary key in a database. If anyone's familiar with databases, you don't want to change your primary key because everything hangs off of that, including NDC codes. And we use that set ID. It's very important. We sometimes find issues with set IDs being changed, and we have ways to find that, but it causes problems. So keep the same set ID.
Excellent. Let's go ahead and take an online question, then I'll come back to the microphone in the room. Online question, please.
This is to Corey. Could you clarify the safety label tracking system? Is this a global system that tracks worldwide changes?
That's correct. It's a global system that tracks safety label change.
That was easy. Yeah. Now microphone in the room, please. Go ahead.
My question's for Corey as well. You had a slide up that looked like once you have your SPL done, that is the document that is then used for everything from that point on, is for promotional management for everything else. Is that correct?
Actually, no, what I was trying to demonstrate there is the source document, which is a Word file, is used not only for SPL, but also for typeset,
Okay.
promotional PI, et
Okay.
cetera. Yeah.
All right, thank
Thank
you.
you.
And anybody else, feel free to step up to the microphones. Let's take an online question, please.
This question is to Lonnie. Are you able to incorporate forest plots or other charts in SPLs?
Oh, that would only be an image
Okay.
file.
Sorry, can I add one thing
I'm
to
sorry,
that?
I missed.
So even though there's a requirement by FDA not to repeat content in labeling, the forest plot versus maybe the chart of information, I will say that when we're analyzing content in the SPL, it's really useful to have that data. I'm not saying to include it, I'm just saying from a downstream user that the data is more beneficial to us trying to analyze the SPL content than the forest plot per se. The forest plot's useful to clinicians too, but just the data is also important.
Okay, now microphone one, please.
Thanks. So I have a question from the user end. If I go to Daily Med and search on a drug and get the listing, and then I click on the PDF to download the PDF, is that PDF pulled together from those SPL elements so that if there's an error in the coding or a missing piece of information, then the PDF will have wrong information or missing information, or is that a different source for that PDF?
That is what's supposed to happen. It's just that a couple years ago, FDA stopped supporting that PDF conversion. So that question would now have to be answered by National Library of Medicine.
Okay, thanks.
Microphone number two, please.
Yeah, hearing some of the issues with the XML file in terms of the absence of certain LOINC codes, that's not a problem, it's just a reality. Or empty spaces, that kind of thing. You know, from a naive viewpoint, one might think, well, why don't we just have more LOINC codes, and why wouldn't a validation process, you know, not validate if there's obvious blank spaces in a document and so on. I'm not asking for more validation rules, believe me. I know that creates issue, but maybe Lonnie, you can speak to how LOINC codes are generated. I know it's more of a universal system, and how that goes, and the issue around these kinds of rules.
The FDA tries not to come up with its own terminology, so whenever possible, we try to use terminology that's already available. And so we decide to use the LOINC code for the identification of the sections. Whenever there is a new section LOINC code proposed, we work with the Regent Street Institute, and they assign the LOINC code, and then we add it to the validation. With regards to your question on missing spaces, we try to validate as much as possible, but at the same time, if there's an intentional missing space that's part of the labeling, then we can't really, you know, universally try to eliminate missing spaces.
Okay, let's go ahead and take an online question, please.
This question came in during Corey's session. What strategy do you suggest to use in order to determine when to submit an updated listing for changes that didn't require FDA's pre-approval?
I mean, I would suggest that as soon as you find out about the change, and if it's something that's implemented in the market or about to be implemented in the market, it's always best to update it as soon as possible. If we have annual reportable changes, for example, we update these at will, and then we report it later on in the annual report during that reporting period.
Okay, and if there's any other questions in the room, please come on up to the mics, but let's go ahead and take our next online question, please.
This question came in during Lonnie's session. What is the basic idea of including marketing start date when filing an SPL for a new filing along with the submission?
I'm not sure I understand following along with the submission, but the purpose of the marketing start date is, number one, it's included for drug listing purposes, but at the same time, the FDA decided to utilize that same data element so that companies can ascertain when their SPL file is made publicly available. We also have a marketing end date, and that's a date. It should be the expiration date of the last lot of the product, and the inclusion of the marketing end date informs the DailyMed system and the FDA system when to remove that data from the public repositories as well.
next online question, please.
This came in during Corey's session. You mentioned that you'll use CDER Direct for the no changes certification SPL. Do you have any thoughts on how this could break the SPL version history, as SPL before the certification will stay separately from then the CDER Direct SPL history?
Well, this will be the first time that we submit this file, so this will be the original submission. I'm not sure I follow the link or the how it's going to break anything, but yeah, I was we're looking at different ways to complete this new requirement, as Ed and Lonnie have mentioned. So the CDER Direct tool, I think, is pretty robust. I'm very impressed with it. You can go on, put your establishment in, and it'll provide the NDC numbers for that establishment, and you can select them, so forth and so on. So yeah, I'm not sure how it would, a set ID would be generated for the submission, and then the next time you would just use that same set ID. So I don't really understand if it would break anything. I think it would be fine to use.
I guess I'll answer the question. This is the first time we implemented what's called the blanket no change certification for product listing, because the rule was effective in November 2016. For the very first blanket no change notification submission, you can use whatever set ID you would like. If you're transferring any of your other types of SPL files to whatever tool, it can be CDER Direct, the X forms, any commercial software, that's when the set ID becomes important, because as long as you insert that set ID in the file that you're updating, the FDA system will recognize it as being as part of that group of SPL files.
Okay, next online question, please.
This came in during Lonnie's presentation. Is there an automatic link between DailyMed and labels.fda.gov so that when DailyMed is updated, labels.fda.gov is automatically updated as well?
There's not an automatic link. However, the FDA system eList will automatically deposit a copy of the SPL file in the DailyMed transmit folder, as well as the labels.fda.gov transmit folder, as well as the OpenFDA transmit folder. With regards to the updates, the agreement we have with National Library of Medicine is to send the SPL files around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and the FDA's preference for updating labels.fda.gov is in the morning, and OpenFDA is updated also in the morning. So there's no direct link to those three systems or web repositories.
Okay, next online question, please.
This also came in during Lonnie's presentation. What triggers a change to the revised date in the highlights section?
Actually, this is Eric Brodsky's request. So this is what, the information that was provided to us. All the information in the SPL files provided by the companies. With regards to the revision date in the highlights section, each section or subsection has an effective time, as I mentioned during my presentation. And so the latest date in the content and labeling section, or FPI, is the date that's used in the highlights revision date field.
Okay, next online question, please.
If we would like LOINC codes assigned to specific elements of the label, is there a process to make this request?
In the guidance for industry for drug establishment registration and listing, we have instructions that you can send an SPL, an email to the SPL at fda.hhs.gov email account for any terminology. So anytime you have any request, whether it be for a new NCI code for the dosage form or a new LOINC code, you can send the request to that email account, and then it'll be triaged and discussed with the appropriate centers.
Okay, we started a little bit late. Let me sneak in one more online question before we go to our break.
This is a question that regards the DailyMed website. Once a label is posted to the DailyMed website, is this label now considered the label of record?
That's a regulatory question, so I will direct you to contact your FDA regulatory review staff.
Eric Brodsky, FDA. So there's a difference between the labeling. There may be a difference between the labeling that is on drugs at FDA versus the labeling that appears on labels.fda.gov or Daily Med. Actually, you could refer to an SBIA talk that we did in the spring of 2017, I believe. The labeling on drugs at FDA is the approved labeling. So it includes the prescribing information. If there's patient labeling, it includes patient labeling. It may or may not contain approved carton container labeling. This is for human drug and biological products. That drugs at FDA labeling excludes allergenics, allergen extracts, vaccines, bloods, cellular and tissue therapy. The labeling on Daily Med is the in-use labeling, which includes a broader set of products, which is human prescription drugs and biological products, over-the-counter drugs, animal drugs, cosmetics, devices, homeopathic products, cosmetics, medical foods, a much broader group of products. Many of those products are not FDA approved. For example, dietary supplements, homeopathics, even products like OTC products regulated under the monograph system. With respect to human prescription drugs and biological products, the labeling may match the labeling on drugs at FDA. However, it may differ. It may include some changes due to annual reportable changes, which could be some editorial changes to the labeling. It may also include some changes due to unapproved or pending CBE 0 labeling supplements, and that's typically additional safety information. So there may be an additional adverse reaction reported in the adverse reaction section on the Daily Med site in comparison to the drugs at FDA site. So the labeling may differ. And you can also refer to the SBIA webinar done in the spring of 2017. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. That's all the time we have for questions. Help me thank all of our presenters, Corey, Lonnie,